I am so excited to share with you part of my conversation with Connecticut Congressman Jim Himes, where we discussed all the most pressing national security issues. So we talked about China, Ukraine, Israel-Gaza, and global intelligence threats. Nothing too scary. Congressman Himes is my own congressman, and he serves as ranking member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and on the House Financial Services Committee. Congressman Himes, thank you so much for joining me on Oh My World. We are so honored to have you.
Well, I'm just delighted to be with you. It's great to be working with a fellow nutmegger.
Exactly. That is especially why I'm excited. We have two major things in common. First is that we are both in Connecticut and Connecticut lovers, obviously. You are my congressman from Connecticut. And also you have a passion and strong focus on foreign policy, which is our love language over here at Oh My World. So I'm excited to talk to you about all the hot button issues in national security right now. So things like China, Ukraine, Israel-Gaza, your intelligence authorization bill, just, a very light load, very happy set of issues.
Okay, good. That shouldn't take more than a couple minutes.
Exactly. Yes. Super easy. Let's start with China, because that has been the news of late after we had reports that President Xi told President Biden at the recent APEC summit that China would reunify with Taiwan. So I was wondering if you could talk to us about how worried you might be that China might try to do something provocative or aggressive toward Taiwan this year, and what more the U.S. can be doing to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, great question. Probably the central question for at least direct U.S. national security right now. Lots of indirect issues, but I think the answer to what happens depends on a lot of things that we don't know about yet. So, for example, the Taiwanese election. Generally people accept that any presidential candidate in Taiwan who is saying we are going to go independent, that would probably catalyze a very belligerent reaction from Beijing. Obviously, what happens inside the Chinese economy matters a lot. And the Chinese economy is not in a place where any of us would want our economy to be in. We're already starting to see signs on the margins of the precarious economy affecting the government's ability to do what it wants. And then lastly, I would say, look, I've now spent years trying to explain to my rowdy legislative colleagues that if there's one area that requires a lot of fairly sophisticated, fairly nuanced, fairly careful thinking, it is China. We do not need to agree with anything they do, although I do believe we have common interests, to make sure we understand how they're thinking and what their words mean. So you started with a question, Xi says we will reunify. Okay. What exactly does that mean? Does that mean that at some point in the generational time frame, is it an aspirational statement, or is Xi saying we're going to invade? How we hear that really matters to the overall dynamic. And, we also need to remember, in particular with the Chinese, that when they say something like that, this is a rising power. This is a power that, now I guess it's maybe not the most populous country in the world, but because India may, I think, have that title, but, that is a rising power that is sort of feeling its way into regional and ultimately global authority. So anyway, the answer to your question depends a lot on conditions that we don't control and a lot on how sophisticated, how statesmanlike we are in reactions to statements like that one.
Well, thankfully, it seems like Washington is following the ball on this one, which is good. Let's talk about Ukraine. We know that the Senate didn't pass a Ukraine aid package back in December, and that they're negotiating this now with the administration. And we know that Senate Republicans, the reason they held off on passing the bill last time was because they wanted to tie Ukraine aid to financing for the southern border. Can you give us a little insight onto how those negotiations are going? And how do you think Putin is watching those negotiations unfold? I mean, what is the message to him? And do you have any concerns there?
Well, let's start with that last piece, of course, right? This is, it's an overused word, but it's existential for Putin. His one way out of this, really his only way out of this, is if the United States and the West generally loses heart and just says, we're taking our money and we're going home. If that happens, at a minimum, Putin probably gets the borders redrawn to where his troops are right now. And though it came at a massive cost in terms of lives and money to Russia, he will be able to spin that as a massive victory. And so he's not the only one watching. President Xi is watching. The North Koreans are watching. Bad guys around the world are watching. In Yemen, they're probably watching and saying, we wonder what U.S. staying power is. And not just staying power with respect to places like Afghanistan and Iraq, where, you could write PhD theses about who is in the right and who is in the wrong on either conflict. When Russia invades and commits war crimes in Ukraine, and we say we're getting tired after 18 months, we're going to walk out of here, the message that will be sent to some very, very bad people will be catastrophic, and we will pay a huge cost down the road. Now, there's all sorts of political pressures on the Republicans, because it is the Republicans who are, I think at this point, certainly in the House of Representatives, opposing Ukraine aid. Roughly half of them are anyway. There's legitimate questions about the end game. I think this is pretextual. The Republicans who are opposing Ukraine aid don't really care if there is an end game. They didn't care about that in Afghanistan. They didn't particularly care about that in Iraq. There's other reasons why they're saying what they are. But this is an inflection point that I think matters for not just Ukraine, Russia, but for China, for North Korea, for Iran. And we better think about it that way.
I want to talk to you about Israel-Gaza, of course. We just learned that Israel would be withdrawing several thousand troops from the northern part of Gaza. Do you view this as a transition to lower intensity operations, the way the United States has been pushing? What I'm getting at is, do you think that Israel's being receptive to the U.S. perspective and U.S. requests in how they pursue this war?
Yeah, the last part of your question is hard to answer. One of the frustrating things here has been that, let's face it, President Biden, the Secretary of State, and others have been pretty direct in public with Israel about how untenable it is to continue the style of warfare that we have observed. And I think they certainly for the last 2 months or so haven't listened. Now, if you want to understand that, Israel at their core has always believed that, it's great to have an alliance with the United States, but at the end of the day, we will always do on our own, if necessary, what is important for the state of Israel. And of course, and I sometimes encourage, not in any way to justify what is occurring in Gaza, because I think it's untenable, but I do encourage Americans of a certain age to remember how the country felt and how you felt personally on 9/12 of 2001, when something as hideous as October 7th or 9/11, and remember, October 7th, relatively speaking, was a much bigger deal for the population wise, bigger deal from the Israelis than 9/11 was for the United States. There is a period in which emotion and rage are kind of the only element in town. And so what I hope is happening is precisely what you suggested maybe, which is that Israel is acknowledging that, the next 2 months cannot involve, 10,000 Palestinians dying every month, and that they need to shift to a much more lower intensity trade. In the way I think about it, trade intensity for time. In other words, there's no reason why this needs to be done in 6 months. And in fact, if the objective is to get whatever it may be done in 6 months, the damage to civilians, to humanitarian concerns will be so high. So the answer is I hope so. And though we don't know exactly what happened in Beirut, where the Hamas military leader was taken out, that too, and again, I don't know that it was Israel, but that too is indicative of a much more surgical, targeted traditional counterterrorism approach rather than the wholesale warfare that we watched for these last 2 months.
Well, and that you mentioned the targeting of the Hamas leader in Beirut, and that's a good segue to my next question, which is about the fact that you see escalating tensions in general in the region. So you have the tensions increasing in Lebanon. You have things becoming more aggressive and volatile and dangerous in the Red Sea, and obviously U.S. bases that have been targeted across the Middle East. How concerned are you that this could escalate even further? And do you think the United States needs to take a more offensive approach when it comes to targeting those Iran-backed groups that are pursuing provocative or aggressive attacks against vessels in the Red Sea, for example, or U.S. bases across the Middle East?
Yeah, the proof is in the pudding, and here we are, just shy of 2 months into this brutal conflict, and it has not been regionalized meaningfully. Yes, the Houthis are launching missiles into the Red Sea, and yes, there is belligerence along the northern border with Israel with Hezbollah. But the kind of apocalyptic scenario where Hezbollah is fully engaged, the Iranians are engaged, that sort of regional war has been avoided. And so, at some level, you have to say, okay, the Biden administration has steered this pretty well with the assistance of 2 carrier strike groups and CARE. I would say, because you asked about the Houthis, I think we need to draw a real distinction and make the distinction really clear that we will not do anything to regionally expand this conflict. For example, take strikes onto Hezbollah ourselves, or facilitate a massive Israeli attack on Hezbollah. We will do everything that we can to keep the war from regionalizing. But, and this is thing 2, we will also defend our core interests. And freedom of navigation is absolutely a U.S. core interest and a global core interest. So I would, easy for me to say, sitting here in Connecticut, I would take a different approach with the Houthis, which is to say, you guys are done. You guys are done. And, maybe we're at that moment because obviously the U.S. Navy took out 3 of their boats. But I would say to the Houthis, look, you can do what you want, but you can't threaten global and U.S. core interests. And you demonstrate that probably by taking out a lot of the launch sites that they are using to launch missiles, and just make it clear that, we're going to not expand this conflict, but you're not either. And that, of course, is what the Houthis have done by creating real dangers and risks inside the Red Sea.
Fantastic. I completely agree with you, by the way, on this. It's so fascinating. It's so great to hear how you phrase that. And as a priority of the United States, it's so true. I have one final question for you, Congressman, and it is about the Intelligence Authorization Act that you led bipartisan efforts to pass with great success. And I wanted to ask you, in light of the pending election and threats that we expect from China, Russia, and potentially others to interfere in our election, and given the rising efforts of AI and sophistication of AI, what does this piece of legislation do to combat those threats?
I'm so glad you asked that, because the Intelligence Authorization Act does a lot of things. The thing that I'm probably most passionate about, and I've been passionate about this for 10 years, and it's particularly important right now that I'm campaigning for Geek of the Week, is to really, I hope, spur efforts inside the intelligence community and the Pentagon to do something that is not natural for them, which is to be open to the most innovative technologies. And I think most people know this story, but both certainly the Pentagon, but also the IC has gotten very used to, over the generations, going with their problems, whatever those problems and challenges may be, to the primes, to Northrop Grumman, to all of the usual suspects. The problem is we now live in a software world. AI being one of those examples, but software is critical to biosynthesis. It's critical to quantum mechanics and quantum computing. And so the entire apparatus, this $800 billion apparatus, needs to be open to the 12 guys in Weston who, outside of Alexandria, who, are running out of cash, but have world-beating visual AI, for example. I really do feature kind of quantum computing, because quantum computing offers the possibility of breaking all encryption. And again, now we're in a totally different world. If we're not on the cutting edge of this stuff, you can draw an analogy to what would have happened in 1944, 1945, had we not dedicated ourselves to being the first one out of the box with nuclear weaponry. Obviously, if the Nazis who were working on it had developed it first, we'd live in a very different world. And I wouldn't push that metaphor too far, because it's not a particularly good metaphor. But the point is, it's really critical that we be out in front on a couple of technologies. And I think the IAA does take some big steps in that direction.
Excellent. Well, good. I'm glad, because those are threats I'm definitely concerned about. Congressman, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and for hanging out with a fellow nutmegger. I'm so honored to have you, and thank you for being our Geek of the Week.